The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Nora McKenzie realized her sheep were going to die. She stood at the edge of her small homestead in Wyoming territory, mud sucking at her worn boots, watching the water rise in the low-lying pasture where her flock huddled together on a rapidly shrinking island of grass. It was April of 1882, and the spring runoff from the mountains combined with the relentless storm had turned Willow Creek from a gentle stream into a raging torrent. The water was creeping higher by the hour, and her 43 sheep, her entire livelihood, were trapped with nowhere to go. Nora was 22 years old and had been managing this land alone for 8 months since her father died of pneumonia the previous autumn. She had no siblings, no husband, and her mother had passed when she was just a girl. The sheep were all she had. Without them, she would lose the homestead, lose everything her father had worked for, and she would have nothing. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the rain showed no signs of stopping. She grabbed a rope from the barn and waded into the cold water herself, gasping as it reached her thighs. The current was stronger than she expected, pulling at her skirts, threatening to sweep her off her feet. She called to the sheep, but they bleated in panic and pressed together, too frightened to move. She tried to loop the rope around the nearest ewe, but the animal thrashed and the water was too deep, too wild. Nora felt tears mixing with the rain on her face as she struggled back to dry ground, shivering and defeated. That was when she saw the rider coming down the muddy road. He sat tall in the saddle despite the downpour, a dark hat pulled low over his eyes, rain streaming off the brim. He rode straight to her fence line and dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the mud with a splash. He was young, maybe 25 or 26, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds. There was something solid about him, something steady even in the chaos of the storm. "Your sheep are in trouble," he called over the sound of the rain and rushing water. It was not a question. "I know," Nora shouted back, her voice cracking. "I cannot get to them. The current is too strong." He was already moving, tying his horse to the fence post and striding toward her. Up close, she could see the concern etched in his features, the set of his jaw that spoke of determination. "How many?" 43, he nodded once, removing his heavy coat and hanging it on the fence. "I will get them out. You stay here and guide them toward the barn once they are on dry ground. Can you do that?" "Who are you?" Nora asked, bewildered. "James Thornton. I work for the Cross Creek Ranch about 12 miles east. I was checking on our northern fence line when I saw your situation." He did not wait for her response before wading into the floodwater. Nora watched in amazement as he pushed through the current with a strength she had not possessed. The water reached his waist, then his chest, but he kept moving forward with steady purpose. When he reached the terrified sheep, he did not rush or grab. Instead, he moved calmly among them, speaking in a low voice she could not hear, but that seemed to quiet the animals. He placed his hands on the nearest sheep, a large ram, and gently but firmly guided it toward the edge of the water. The ram resisted at first, but James was patient, coaxing and steering until the animal took its first step into the flood. James stayed beside it, one hand on its wool, using his body to block the worst of the current. Slowly, incrementally, they moved through the water. When the ram's hooves found purchase on the rising ground, it scrambled up to safety. The other sheep, seeing their leader escape, began to move restlessly. James immediately waded back in. For the next 2 hours, Nora watched as he made trip after trip through that dangerous water. He guided them out in groups of 3 or 4 when they would follow each other, alone when they balked. His shirt was soaked through, clinging to broad shoulders that never seemed to tire. His face remained focused, almost serene, despite the cold that must have been seeping into his bones. He slipped once, going under completely, and Nora's heart stopped until his head broke the surface and he continued on as if nothing had happened. Some of the sheep were easy, following docilely once they felt his steady hands. Others panicked, thrashing and fighting, but James never lost patience. He talked to them constantly, his voice a low rumble that somehow cut through the storm. When a young lamb froze in terror halfway across, he scooped it into his arms and carried it, then went back for its frantic mother. Nora did her part, calling to the sheep as they reached safety, herding them toward the barn where they would be dry and protected. Her heart pounded every time James disappeared under the surface to grab a sheep that had lost its footing. Every time he emerged again, water streaming from his hair, sheep in tow, she felt a strange mixture of relief and something else she could not quite name. The light was fading when he guided the last ewe out of the water. 43 sheep, every single one, now safely crowded into her barn and the small attached pen under the roof's overhang. James stood at the water's edge, chest heaving, his hands braced on his knees as he caught his breath. Then he straightened and walked toward where she stood. "That is all of them," he said simply, as if he had just completed some ordinary task instead of something extraordinary. Nora found herself unable to speak for a moment. This stranger had risked his life for her sheep, had spent hours in freezing floodwater to save the animals of a woman he had never met. "I do not know how to thank you," she finally managed. "You saved everything I have in this world." James looked at her properly for the first time, and she felt the intensity of his gaze even through the rain. "You do not need to thank me. It was the right thing to do." "You are freezing," she said, noticing how he was shivering despite trying to hide it. "Please come inside." "I have a fire and dry clothes that were my father's. You will catch your death out here." He hesitated, clearly not wanting to impose, but another violent shiver ran through him and he nodded. "Just for a little while until the rain lets up." Nora led him to her small cabin, acutely aware of how modest it must seem. The single room served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom with a loft above for storage, but it was clean and warm, with a fire crackling in the stone hearth. She quickly pulled out her father's spare clothes from the trunk, grateful she had not yet been able to bring herself to give them away. "You can change behind that screen," she said, pointing to the corner where she had rigged up a sheet for privacy. "I will make coffee." While James changed, Nora busied herself with the coffee pot, trying not to think about the stranger undressing just a few feet away. Her hands shook slightly as she measured the grounds, and she told herself it was just the aftermath of fear and relief, nothing more. When James emerged, wearing her father's dry shirt and trousers, she was struck by how different he looked. Younger somehow, less intimidating. His dark hair was towel-dried and slightly unruly, and there was color coming back into his face as he warmed up. He hung his wet clothes near the fire and accepted the steaming cup of coffee she offered with evident gratitude. "This is good," he said after taking a long sip. "Thank you." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, listening to the rain hammer on the roof. Then Nora said, "What you did today, I have never seen anything like it. Most men would not have stopped, or they would have tried for a few and given up. But you saved everyone." James shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "My father raised sheep before he died. I grew up around them. I know how they think, how to move them, and I know what it is like to stand to lose everything." "Your father, he is gone," Nora asked softly. 5 years ago, he and my mother both in a fire. I was 21. He stared into his coffee cup. "I had to sell our land to pay their debts. That is when I started working for other ranches. The Cross Creek outfit took me on, and I have been there since." "I am sorry," Nora said. "My father died last autumn, pneumonia. He built this place from nothing, proved up the homestead claim. I am trying to keep it going, but it is harder than I thought it would be." James met her eyes. "You are doing it alone." "I am alone in the world now, but I am not giving up this land. My father loved it, believed in it. I will make it work somehow." Something shifted in James's expression, a look of respect mixed with concern. "It is hard country for anyone, let alone a woman alone. Do you have help? Anyone who checks on you?" "The family 5 miles south, the Hendersons, they come by sometimes, and I go to town every few weeks for supplies." "I manage." She said it firmly, as if saying it with conviction would make it more true. "You should not be out here alone," James said, then quickly added, "Not because you are not capable. Anyone could see you are strong and determined. But if something happened, if you got hurt or sick, no one would know." "I am careful," Nora said, though his words touched something deep inside her, the fear she carried alone in the dark hours of the night. They talked as the storm continued outside, the initial awkwardness gradually fading. James told her about his work at Cross Creek Ranch, about the cattle drives and the rhythm of ranch life. Nora told him about learning to shear sheep from her father, about her plans to expand her flock if she could save enough money. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by comfortable silences. As evening deepened, the rain finally began to ease. James stood reluctantly. "I should head back. They will be wondering where I am at the ranch, in the dark. In this weather," Nora protested. "It is not safe." "Please stay until morning. You can sleep in the loft. It is dry and warm." James hesitated, propriety warring with practicality on his face. "I do not want to compromise your reputation. There is no one around for miles to see, and even if there were, you saved my livelihood today. Anyone who would speak ill of simple hospitality is not worth worrying about." Nora surprised herself with her boldness, but she found she did not want him to leave, to disappear into the night and perhaps never return. James smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face. "All right." "Thank you. I will leave at first light." Nora made a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, apologizing for its plainness, but James ate with evident appreciation. They continued talking, and Nora found herself laughing for the first time in months at his dry observations about some of the characters at Cross Creek Ranch. When it was time to sleep, James climbed the ladder to the loft while Nora banked the fire and settled into her bed in the corner. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the now gentle rain and the quiet sounds of another person breathing in her home. It was comforting, that sound, the knowledge that she was not alone tonight. And when she finally drifted off to sleep, she felt safer than she had since her father died. Morning came with weak sunlight filtering through breaking clouds. Nora woke to find James already up, adding wood to the fire. He had changed back into his own clothes, now dry, and was preparing to leave. "There is oatmeal," Nora said, rising quickly. "Let me make you breakfast before you go." They ate together as the dawn light grew stronger. When it was time for James to leave, he paused at the door, his hat in his hands. "I will come back," he said suddenly. "In a few days, when I have time off, I want to make sure you and the sheep are all right." "You do not have to do that," Nora said, though her heart lifted at the thought. "I want to," James said firmly, "if that is all right with you." "It is more than all right," Nora admitted. "I would like that very much." He smiled again, that wonderful smile that made him look almost boyish, and then he was gone, riding back toward Cross Creek Ranch through the muddy morning. Nora spent the next few days in a strange state of anticipation. She told herself she was simply grateful for his help, that her eagerness for his return was just the loneliness of her isolated life. But she found herself taking extra care with her appearance, brushing her light brown hair until it shone and wearing her better dress instead of her usual work clothes. James returned 4 days later, in the late afternoon. He brought supplies, a sack of grain for the sheep and some coffee and sugar for her. "I thought you might be running low," he said, almost shyly. They walked the property together, James examining the fences that had been damaged by the flood, pointing out repairs that needed to be made. He worked for hours, fixing posts and restringing wire, refusing to leave until the job was done properly. Nora worked beside him, handing him tools, holding posts steady, and they fell into an easy rhythm of cooperation. Over the following weeks, James became a regular presence at the homestead. He would arrive on his days off, always with some excuse, some project that needed doing or some knowledge he wanted to share about managing sheep. But Nora knew, and she thought James knew too, that the real reason he came was simply to be together. They were falling in love, though neither spoke the words. It was there in the way James's hand would linger on hers when she passed him a tool, in the way Nora's face would light up when she saw him riding down the road. It was in the long conversations that stretched into evening, in the comfortable silences as they worked side by side, in the way they seemed to move around each other with increasing ease and familiarity. One evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, James said quietly, "I have been thinking about my future, about what I want from life." Nora's heart beat faster. "And what do you want?" James turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious and full of emotion. "I want land of my own again someday. I want a family. I want to build something that lasts, something I can be proud of. But mostly," he reached over and took her hand, "mostly I want to be with you." Tears sprang to Nora's eyes. "James, I have been so afraid to hope, afraid that you were just being kind, that this was just friendship." "It is more than friendship," James said firmly. "It has been more almost from the beginning. That first day when I saw you standing there in the rain, so brave and fierce and heartbroken, something in my chest just knew. I know this is fast. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but I am falling in love with you, Nora. I think I have been since the moment I waded into that flood." "I am falling in love with you too," Nora whispered. "I tried to tell myself it was gratitude, but it is so much more than that. When you are here, everything feels right. When you are gone, I count the hours until you return." James lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Then I have something to ask you, though I know I should wait, should court you properly, but I am not a patient man when it comes to things that matter. Nora McKenzie, would you consider marrying me? I do not have much to offer yet except hard work and a loyal heart, but I swear I will spend my life making you happy." "Yes," Nora said, the word coming out choked with emotion. "Yes, James, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms then, and they held each other as the sun sank below the mountains and the first stars appeared. When he finally kissed her, it was tender and sweet and full of promise. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in the nearest town, with the Henderson family as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony, but to Nora it was perfect. She wore her mother's dress, carefully preserved in the trunk, and James wore a new shirt he had bought especially for the occasion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with such gentle reverence that Nora felt tears of joy streaming down her face. James gave notice at Cross Creek Ranch, and they began their life together on the homestead. He brought his few possessions, his horse and his savings, which they used to buy more sheep and improve the property. They worked together from dawn to dusk, building their future with their own hands. The first months of marriage were an adjustment, learning to share space and make decisions together, but the foundation of friendship and respect they had built made it easier. James was patient and kind, never dismissive of Nora's knowledge and experience with the land. Nora, in turn, appreciated his strength and the way he seemed to anticipate problems before they arose. The physical side of their marriage unfolded naturally, with tenderness and growing passion. On their wedding night, James had been gentle, attentive to her inexperience and her needs. As the weeks passed, their intimacy deepened, becoming another language through which they expressed their love. Nora had never imagined feeling so complete, so utterly cherished by autumn. The flock had grown to 60 sheep, and they were discussing plans to add cattle in the spring. The homestead was thriving under their combined efforts. James had built an addition to the cabin, giving them more space and a proper bedroom. They had also constructed a larger barn and improved the irrigation from the creek, which had returned to its peaceful flow after the dramatic spring floods. One evening in October, as they sat by the fire after a long day of work, Nora said, "I have news." James looked up from the harness he was mending. "Good news, I hope." "I think so. I am fairly certain I am with child." James dropped the harness, his face transforming with wonder. "Truly." "You are sure?" "As sure as I can be. I have been feeling poorly in the mornings for 2 weeks now, and my monthly time has not come. I think the baby will arrive sometime in late spring." James crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "This is the best news. You have made me the happiest man alive." "You are happy then? I know we have only been married a short time and there is so much work to do here." "I am more than happy. I am overjoyed. A child, our child." He placed a hand gently on her still flat stomach. "This is everything I dreamed of, a family with you." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter. James became even more protective, insisting on doing the heavier work and worrying whenever Nora so much as sneezed. She found his concern endearing even when it bordered on excessive. Mrs. Henderson came by regularly as Nora's belly grew, offering advice and reassurance from her own experiences birthing 6 children. On a warm day in June of 1883, after a labor that lasted from dawn until mid-afternoon, Nora gave birth to a healthy baby boy. James was there throughout, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement. When the baby finally emerged, wailing lustily, and Mrs. Henderson placed him in Nora's arms, both parents wept with joy. "He is perfect," James said, his voice thick with emotion as he touched one tiny fist. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Nora asked, exhausted but radiant. "I was thinking, if you agree, we could name him William after your father. He would be proud to have a grandson carrying on his name and living on this land." Fresh tears streamed down Nora's face. "That is perfect. William Thornton. Billy for short." Billy proved to be a good-natured baby, which was fortunate given the demands of homestead life. Nora wore him in a sling while doing lighter chores, and James could often be seen working one-handed because he was holding his son with the other arm. They were utterly besotted with their child. As Billy grew from infant to toddler, the homestead continued to prosper. They had added 30 head of cattle to their sheep, and James had proven to have a good head for business. He negotiated fair prices in town and built relationships with buyers from the east. By the time Billy was 2, they had saved enough money to buy the adjacent parcel of land when it came up for sale, doubling their holdings. Nora had never imagined feeling so content. Every day she woke beside the man she loved, in a home they had built together, with their son's laughter filling the rooms. It was more than she had dared to hope for that terrible day when she had stood in the rain, watching her sheep trapped by rising water. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Billy chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Nora said, "Do you ever think about that day, the flood?" "I think about it all the time," James said, pulling her close. "It was the day my life truly began. I had been just existing before that, going through the motions, working for other people's dreams. But when I saw you standing there, so determined not to give up, something inside me woke up. I knew I wanted to be part of something like that kind of fierce love for the land and willingness to fight for it. I thought I was going to lose everything that day," Nora said softly. "The sheep, the land, my father's legacy. I felt so alone and helpless. And then you appeared out of the storm like an answer to a prayer I had not even had time to say." "Maybe that is what we were," James said. "Answers to each other's prayers. You needed someone to help with the sheep that day, but you also needed someone to share this life with. And I needed purpose, needed to feel like I was building towards something real. We needed each other." "I love you," Nora said, turning in his arms to kiss him. "More now than even on the day we married, and I loved you fiercely then. You are the best man I have ever known. And you are the strongest, most remarkable woman I have ever met," James replied. "I am grateful every single day that I rode down that muddy road and found you." Billy ran up to the porch, clutching a captured firefly carefully in his small hands. "Look, Mama, look, Papa, I caught one." They admired his prize and then gently helped him release it, watching the insect float away into the darkening sky. Billy yawned hugely, and Nora scooped him up for bedtime. As she rocked their son and sang him to sleep, James watched from the doorway with such love in his eyes that it made her heart ache in the best possible way. Another year passed, bringing both challenges and triumphs. A hard winter killed some of their sheep, but their cattle thrived, and the spring lambing season was successful. Nora discovered she was pregnant again, and in March of 1885 she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Rose after James's mother, and she had her mother's light brown hair and her father's gray eyes. Billy, now nearly 3, was enchanted with his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. He would bring Nora cloths for the baby and pat Rose's head with excessive gentleness while saying, nice baby," over and over. The homestead had become more than just a surviving enterprise. It was thriving, known throughout the region for quality wool and healthy livestock. James had built a reputation as a fair dealer and a skilled rancher, and people came to him for advice. Nora had started a small garden that provided vegetables for the family and extras to sell in town. Together, they had created something remarkable. But beyond the material success, it was the love that filled their home that made it special. James and Nora had built their marriage on a foundation of mutual respect, shared goals, and genuine affection that had only deepened with time. They still talked for hours the way they had in those early days, still found excuses to touch each other in passing, still looked at each other with eyes full of love. On a summer evening when Billy was 5 and Rose was 2, the family took a walk together to the spot where the flood had trapped the sheep 3 years earlier. Willow Creek burbled peacefully through its banks, giving no hint of the dangerous torrent it had once been. "Papa, tell the story again," Billy begged, as he often did. He never tired of hearing how his parents had met. James lifted Billy onto his shoulders while Nora carried Rose on her hip. "Well," James began in the storytelling voice Billy loved, "it was raining harder than you have ever seen, and the water was rising fast. Your mama was standing right about here watching her sheep get trapped on that little island there. And you saved them," Billy interrupted excitedly. "I did. I waded into that cold water and guided every single sheep out to safety. 43 sheep, one by one and in small groups, until they were all safe in the barn. Because you are brave," Billy said with certainty. "Because it was the right thing to do," James corrected gently. "And because I took one look at your mama and knew she was special. I knew I wanted to help her, to know her, to be part of her life." Nora smiled up at her husband and son. "And I took one look at your papa wading into that dangerous water and thought he was the most courageous man I had ever seen. Before that day, I thought I had to do everything alone, but your papa showed me that letting someone help you, letting someone in, is not weakness, it is strength. And now we are a family," Billy announced happily. "Now we are a family," James agreed, reaching down to squeeze Nora's hand. They stood there together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The sheep grazed peacefully in a different pasture now, safe behind sturdy fences. The cattle lowed in the distance. The creek sang its gentle song. And the Thornton family stood together in the place where their story had begun. That night, after the children were asleep, James and Nora sat on their porch in the comfortable silence of a couple who knew each other deeply. The stars were brilliant overhead and a warm breeze carried the scent of sage and grass. "Do you ever regret it?" Nora asked suddenly. "Giving up your work at Cross Creek, settling here, tying yourself to this life," James turned to her in surprise. "Regret it?" "Nora, this is everything I ever wanted. This land, this family, I wake up every morning grateful. Why would you even ask? I do not know. Sometimes I just want to be sure you are happy, that you do not feel trapped." James pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Listen to me. That day I rode down this road and saw you in the rain, my life changed completely. Before that, I was just drifting, working for wages, going through the motions. But you gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to build and plan and dream. This homestead is as much mine as yours now, not because of any legal paper, but because we built it together. Because every fence post and every planted seed and every animal born here is part of our shared life. I have never been happier, never felt more fulfilled than I do right now." "I love you so much," Nora said, her voice breaking slightly. Sometimes it almost frightens me how much, like maybe I do not deserve this much happiness. You deserve every bit of it, James said firmly. You are the hardest working, kindest, most determined person I know. You took a tragedy and turned it into something beautiful. You let me into your life and your heart. If anyone deserves happiness, it is you. They made love that night with the tenderness and passion of a couple who had grown together, learned each other's bodies and hearts completely. Afterward, lying tangled together in their bed, Nora felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. The years continued to roll by, marked by the seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. Billy grew tall and strong, learning everything his father could teach him about animals and the land. Rose was bright and fearless, following her brother everywhere and insisting she could do anything he could do. In 1888, Nora gave birth to another son, whom they named Thomas, and in 1890 a third daughter arrived, Margaret. The homestead had become a proper ranch by then, with a larger house that James had built room by room, a substantial barn, multiple outbuildings, and significant herds of both cattle and sheep. They employed 3 hired hands, and the Thornton Ranch was known as one of the most successful operations in the region. But despite their prosperity, James and Nora never forgot their beginnings. Every year on the anniversary of the flood, they would walk together to Willow Creek and stand where it had all started. As the children grew older, they came to understand the significance of the tradition. That flood could have ruined us, Nora said one year as they stood by the creek. Billy was 12 now, old enough to understand adult things. We had no money, no help, no options. If your father had not stopped that day, if he had just ridden by, I would have lost everything. But Papa did not ride by, Billy said. He helped. He did more than help, Nora corrected. He risked his life in dangerous floodwater, over and over again, for animals that were not his, for a woman he did not know. That tells you what kind of man your father is. Billy looked at his father with evident admiration. James, uncomfortable as always with praise, just shrugged. Anyone would have done the same. No, Nora said firmly. Not anyone. Most people would have thought it was too dangerous, too much trouble, not their problem. But you saw someone in need and you helped without hesitation, without thought of reward. That is who you are, James Thornton, and I thank God every day that you rode down our road. James pulled her close and kissed her forehead. Best decision I ever made, wading into that water, not just because of the sheep, but because it brought me you. As the children grew toward adulthood, the story of how their parents met became a cherished family legend, told and retold until everyone knew it by heart. Billy, in particular, seemed to draw inspiration from it. When he was 16, he jumped into a frozen pond to save a neighbor's child who had fallen through the ice, and when people called him a hero, he said simply, "I am my father's son. When someone needs help, you help." Rose grew into a spirited young woman who had inherited her mother's determination and her father's steady courage. Thomas was quiet and thoughtful, with a gift for working with horses. Margaret, the baby, was bold and bright and kept everyone entertained with her observations and questions. As Nora approached her 40th birthday in 1900, she looked at her life with wonder. The frightened, desperate young woman who had stood in the rain watching her sheep drown seemed like a different person. That woman had been alone, struggling, uncertain of her future. Now Nora was surrounded by love, secure in a thriving ranch, confident in her abilities and her place in the world. James, at 43, had silver threading through his dark hair, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But to Nora, he was as handsome as the young man who had waded into floodwater for her. More handsome, even, because now she knew every facet of his character, every generous impulse, every moment of quiet strength. One evening, sitting together on the porch as they had done countless times before, James said, "I have been thinking about the future." "What about it?" Nora asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Billy will want to run this ranch someday. He has a gift for it, same as we do." "But Rose is talking about becoming a teacher, Thomas wants to breed horses, and Margaret is still too young to know what she wants. I think we need to plan for all of them, make sure they all have opportunities." "You are a good father," Nora said softly. "Thinking about their futures, wanting to provide for all of them." "I had nothing when I started out," James said. "No land, no family, no prospects. I want our children to have more than that. I want them to have choices." They talked late into the night, making plans and dreams for their children's futures. They decided to start a fund for Rose's teacher training, to set aside land for Thomas to start his horse breeding operation, and to ensure Billy understood he would not be inheriting the ranch but rather partnering in it, earning his place through work and skill. Margaret, only 10 years old, listened from her bedroom window and felt a swell of love for her parents. She understood, even at her young age, that she was part of something special, a family built on love and respect and hard work. In 1905, Billy married a sweet-tempered young woman named Emma from a neighboring ranch, and they settled in a house that James and Billy built together on the far end of the Thornton property. The family ranch was becoming a true legacy, with multiple generations working the land together. Rose did indeed become a teacher, opening a school in the nearest town but returning home every weekend to be with her family. Thomas married in 1907 and started his horse breeding operation, which quickly gained a reputation for quality animals. Margaret showed signs of wanting to follow her sister into teaching, much to Nora's delight. As grandchildren began to arrive, Nora and James found new depths of joy. Billy and Emma had 3 children in quick succession, and Thomas and his wife added 2 more to the growing Thornton clan. The ranch house was often full of noise and laughter, children running through rooms where their parents had once played. On a spring day in 1910, James and Nora took a rare afternoon away from the bustle of family life to ride out to Willow Creek. It had been 28 years since the flood, 28 years since a desperate young woman and a kind-hearted cowboy had found each other in a storm. They dismounted and stood hand in hand by the gentle creek, both of them thinking about that long-ago day. James was 53 now, his hair more silver than dark, his body still strong but carrying the marks of years of hard work. Nora, at 49, had lines around her eyes and gray threading through her hair, but her spirit was as fierce and determined as ever. 28 years, Nora said softly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Both, James agreed. We were so young then, I was just 25, thought I knew everything, but I knew nothing about what life could be. I was terrified that day, Nora admitted. Not just about losing the sheep, though that was bad enough. I was terrified of being alone, of failing, of not being strong enough to survive on my own. But you were strong enough, James said. You would have found a way even without me. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Maybe, Nora said, but I am glad I did not have to do it alone. I am glad you stopped, glad you waded into that water, glad you came back and kept coming back until somehow we ended up here. James pulled her close, and they stood wrapped in each other's arms as the creek murmured and the cottonwood trees rustled in the breeze. I would do it again, he said. I would wade into that water 1,000 times, would make the same choice every single time, because every decision I made that day led me to this life with you. We built something good, Nora said, looking back toward where the ranch buildings were visible in the distance. Not just the ranch, though that is thriving, but the family, the love, the legacy. Our children are good people, James. They work hard, they care about others, they know the value of helping those in need. That is because of you, because of the example you set. It is because of both of us, James corrected. You taught them determination and resilience. You showed them what it means to fight for what you believe in, to never give up even when things look hopeless. I just taught them about sheep and cattle. Nora laughed. You taught them so much more than that, and you know it. You taught them integrity and kindness and the importance of showing up when someone needs help. Those are lessons that matter. They stood there until the sun began to sink toward the western mountains. painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and rose. Then they mounted their horses and rode back toward the ranch, toward the house full of children and grandchildren, toward the life they had built together from a single moment of courage in rising Floodwater. That evening, with the whole family gathered for Sunday dinner as had become tradition, Billy stood and raised his glass. "I want to make a toast," he announced, "to Mama and Papa who built this ranch and this family from nothing but hard work and love. Everything we have, everything we are, started with them." Everyone raised their glasses, and James felt his throat tighten with emotion. He looked around the table at his children and their spouses, at his grandchildren, at Nora beside him with her eyes bright with happy tears. This was his legacy, more valuable than land or livestock or any material wealth. This family, bound together by love and mutual respect, was the real treasure. After dinner, as had become custom, someone asked for the story of how James and Nora had met. Little Emma, Billy's oldest daughter and just 5 years old, crawled into James's lap. "Tell it, Grandpa, tell about the flood." So James told the story once again, with Nora adding details and corrections as she always did. He told about the rain and the rising water, about the terrified sheep trapped on their shrinking island of safety. He told about wading in, about guiding each animal out one by one, about the cold and the current and the determination not to give up. "But why did you do it, Grandpa?" Emma asked. "Why did you help Grandma when you did not even know her?" James looked at his granddaughter, at her innocent face and curious eyes, and tried to find the right words. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "Because when you see someone in need, someone struggling, you help them if you can. You do not think about whether it is convenient or safe or what you will get out of it. You just help, because that is what good people do." And he added, smiling at Nora, "Because sometimes helping someone in need brings you more than you ever imagined. It brought me a wife, a family, a home, a life worth living, all from one day of wading through Floodwater." "I love that story," Emma said, snuggling against his chest. "So do I," James said softly, catching Nora's eye across the room. "So do I." The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own mixture of joys and sorrows, challenges and triumphs. James and Nora faced them all together, their partnership as strong as ever. When James's health began to fail in his early 60s, Nora nursed him with patient devotion. When Nora suffered a bad fall and broke her arm, James hovered over her recovery with anxious care. But they remained active and involved in the ranch and family life well into their 60s and beyond. They saw their grandchildren grow and begin having children of their own. The Thornton Ranch continued to thrive under Billy's management, with input and help from Thomas and occasional visits from Rose and Margaret. On a spring morning in 1925, James woke before dawn as he had done for decades. He was 68 years old, and his joints ached more than they used to, but his mind was clear and his heart was full. He looked over at Nora, still sleeping beside him as she had for 43 years of marriage, and felt the same surge of love and gratitude he had felt on their wedding day. He rose quietly and walked out onto the porch to watch the sunrise. The ranch stretched out before him, peaceful in the early light. Cattle grazed in the distance. The sheep, descendants of those he had rescued so long ago, were beginning to stir. Smoke rose from the chimney of Billy's house, and he could see lights coming on in Thomas's place as well. All of this, everything he could see, had grown from a single decision to help a desperate young woman on a rain-soaked day 43 years ago. One choice, one act of simple decency had led to all of this richness, all of this love. Nora came out to join him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. At 65, she was still beautiful to him, still the brave young woman he had seen standing in the rain. She slipped her hand into his and they stood together watching the sun rise over the mountains. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "Everything," James said. "The flood, the sheep, the day we met. How one moment can change everything. How lucky I am." "We are both lucky," Nora said. We found each other, built a life together, raised a family we can be proud of. Not everyone gets that. No, James agreed. Not everyone gets that, but we did. We took that terrible, frightening day and turned it into something beautiful. They stood together in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of the household waking up, grandchildren's voices calling out, the clatter of breakfast preparations. Their family, their legacy, their love made manifest in the next generation and the one after that. James and Nora lived many more good years together, surrounded by family and love. When James passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76 in 1933, the entire community turned out for his funeral. Speaker after speaker told stories of his kindness, his integrity, his willingness to help anyone in need. But Nora, holding tightly to her children's hands, remembered him best as the young man who had waded into dangerous floodwater for her sheep, the man who had saved her in every way a person can be saved. Nora lived another 12 years, active and sharp-minded until the end. She watched her great-grandchildren grow, tended her garden, and kept the family stories alive. On warm spring days, she would walk down to Willow Creek and stand where it had all begun, remembering James and the life they had shared. When Nora passed away in 1945 at the age of 85, she was buried next to James on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to remember them, to tell the stories, to honor the legacy of love and hard work and simple human decency they had left behind. The Thornton Ranch continued through the generations that followed, still in family hands, still thriving. And every year, on the anniversary of the flood, whoever was running the ranch would walk down to Willow Creek with their children and tell the story of how it all began, of the cowboy who waded into rising floodwater and guided every single sheep out, and found his whole life waiting for him on the other side.